Good afternoon, average engineers. Today I wanted to talk about a problem that I was working on recently, and I wrote an article on Substack about it on my newsletter. I'll link to it in the comments. And the title of the article is called JSON with Rust, Thoughts on Being Explicit versus Vague. Now I think this is an interesting topic, especially when we're talking about Rust and maybe a little Python. When you write code, do you write explicit code? Is it verbose, or are you vague when you can be? Do you take shortcuts, use syntactic sugar, things like that? I guess this is an interesting topic to think about. And today we're going to talk about it in the case of Rust, which everyone thinks about as very verbose, very low level, statically typed language. So this is an interesting thing to talk about, especially in the Rust context. In this instance, I was using Rust to process some JSON. And it just got me thinking, as someone who uses Python a lot for the majority of my data engineering work, especially in the ML space, of course it's Python. Anybody who's used Python knows that, everything in Python's vague. Everything's, an object. There's no static typing. Being explicit with data types isn't really a thing that you have to do or need to do in Python. It's Python. You can do whatever you want. But I've noticed over the years that I like being explicit and I don't like being vague about things. And I was working on this Rust project using Rust to read JSON, and it kind of brought this issue to light again. I think it'll make sense when you look at what I'm talking about. So here is the JSON that I was working with. It's a list of tickers, stock tickers for publicly traded companies. This is what it looks like. It looks like pretty normal JSON, right? It's got different elements iterated over. It's got, a ticker, Microsoft, the title, corp, it's got an ID to go along with that ticker, right? Pretty normal JSON-y looking stuff. Before I get into the Rust part, I want to talk about what it looks like probably to do this with Python. Here's a little Python snippet. This is what most people would do with Python. They would simply import JSON, open the file, load it up, and just start iterating through the JSON, assuming that, the value ticker's in there, the value title. You just kind of go on your merry way, right? I mean, this is extremely normal Python code, right? You read the file on the spot, process a JSON, another. There's nothing in this Python code that tells you what the JSON looks like. You don't know what other fields are in there, what to expect. There's nothing that enforces anything. Sure, I think you can do that stuff with Python, but that's typically not what people do. People use Python for a reason, and they don't really care what the structure of the JSON is. They don't care if it's right. They don't really know the data types. It's just like whatever. I mean, sure, there's things you can do in Python, JSON schema, Pydantic. There's stuff you could do to make Python act more rigid and be more explicit, but most people don't use Python that way. Anyways, back to Rust. So I was working on this project. I needed to basically take these JSON values and put them in a SQLite database. But it got me thinking that there's really two ways I could write this Rust. One of them is very Rust-like, and the other one's kind of like Python. One of them's very explicit, and the other one is very vague. The way that I thought felt correct was to make a struct, a ticker struct, right? That kind of basically shows you what the structure of what I would expect those JSON objects to look like. Here it is. And a type, a ticker map, right? With a hash map of string and ticker that we could iterate through. I mean, seems very, Rust-like, right? And of course, here's my function where in Rust, I'm opening that file, getting a buffer. I set up my tickers here, and Saturday JSON, I can, from the reader, read in that ticker map, and then, right, that JSON is kind of forced into that struct, and then you can see I can start looping through that hash map and accessing the elements of that struct by the dot notation, right? Like, here's my company ticker and company title. I mean, you can take a minute to look at that code, but it's, very verbose. It's very, like this is how I would expect Rust to handle JSON. This is what I would expect Rust to look like. And when you look at the code, you look at the struct all together, if somebody's debugging this, it's very obvious what that JSON is. I don't have to go look at a sample file. Oh, what's this JSON look like? Anything like that? No, it's like right there. But it got me thinking, I could be lazy with Rust too. I mean, I'm a Python programmer. Why don't I be lazy? How could I be lazy? I could use the Saturday JSON value, and what I could basically do is just smush the tickers into that value, no struct, right? And I'm thinking about here, I'm reducing the amount of code. I took away a struct and a type, right? I deleted code. That's usually a good idea. I went ahead and read that value, start a JSON from reader, read that file, and then I can just start looping through that JSON and basically saying, I'm going to go through this map, and, if there's a ticker in here, I'll get it. If there's a title in here, I'll get it. You can see that like value.ticker, value.title, right? It's just a totally different way to deal with JSON. It seems more like this is what you'd expect out of Python. It just got me thinking that, is this a good way to write this? I mean, I reduced the amount of code, right? But it's also vague. It's not really, it doesn't seem like a Rust thing to do. I'm not sure what, Rust programmers think of that, sort of dealing with that sort of vagueness versus being explicit. And it just really made me think that sometimes it's more about the programmer than it is about the language. I mean, things like Rust, they really protect the programmer from themselves. It's very explicit compared to Python. Python, you can do whatever, but even in Rust, I can choose to do things a certain way if I want to do that. Not even Rust stopped me from being explicit, or being vague, I should say. I mean, yes, Rust does a better job than pretty much any other language protecting us from us. That's why it's popular. But at the end of the day, is it really about the developer and the way they approach that problem? Because no matter what language it is, they can pretty much decide, I'm going to, be very vague here in what I'm writing. I just thought it was an interesting example of being verbose versus being explicit. Again, I think I like using the types, being very explicit when I'm going to work on that code base. I know what to expect. I can open it up and I don't have to try to wonder what's in the JSON file. Just feels very Rust-like to me. Honestly, writing it the other way in Rust feels more like Python. If I'm going to do that, why wouldn't I just write Python? Because I'm basically throwing away what makes Rust good at that point. I'd be curious to know what you guys think. I'll check out that article, leave a comment, let me know.